Hi guys, this is Cabal, TGN, and welcome to part 1 of my macro series. This is a very basic tutorial for writing macros in World of Warcraft. We're just going to cover the basics of using the macro editor, using macro commands, and using macro conditionals. Before we dive into macro creation, let's take a little bit of time to figure out how to use a macro editor. Now there are a couple different ways to pull the editor up. The most common way is to go through the menu, so you hit escape and then go to macros like that. Alternatively, you can type /m and that'll pull it up also. So we're going to start off and make a very basic macro that all it will do is bring up the macro editor. So we're going to start by clicking new, name it macro, enter, and we're going to type /m, and we're going to drag it over to the action bar like this. Now close the editor and then click on the macro button. Notice that it pulls up our editor. Just a nice little convenience. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about macro commands. There are a ton of macro commands in WoW. For example, /flex, flex, does the little flex emote and the flex animation. Another example of a command is /t. I'm going to say nice to Cryptavian. That's another command. For this tutorial, we're going to focus on one command in particular, which is the /cast command. The best way that I can explain the /cast command is by walking through an example obliterate macro for a Frost Death Knight. Okay, so we're going to start off by opening the macro editor, so click on your little macro thing right there, and then come over to specific macros. In the case of this character, it's Kinski specific macros, and we're going to create a new macro. Click on new, type obliterate, hit enter. Notice that we didn't choose an icon for it, and in the macro text body, type /cast obliterate. And then click save. See the icon appear there? Okay, now drag the obliterate icon over to the action bar like this. Now notice that I manually typed obliterate out. There's another way of providing spell names, which is arguably a little bit safer. It is to locate the ability in your spell book. So let's find obliterate. Okay, actually obliterate right there, and then shift click. Notice how it pasted it into the macro text area. Just another little convenient feature. Now one thing you'll notice is that when I mouse over the obliterate macro, it doesn't show the tooltip for obliterate. Fortunately, this is something we can fix. Go back into the macro editor, and we're going to hit enter, and on the first line we're going to type #show tooltip. Click save. And notice that now when we mouse over obliterate, it shows the tooltip. Okay, now that we have our obliterate macro set up, we're going to test it. So I'm going to pull one of these mobs over here. I think actually both of them will add. So let me open up with outbreak, and let's test our obliterate. Notice that obliterate did work. Okay, there's one more thing that we can do to this macro to make it just a little bit better. Pull up the macro editor, and on the third line type /start attack. This will guarantee that every time you invoke this macro, it will place you in auto attack on your current target. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our basic obliterate macro. Now we're going to move on to the topic of using macro conditionals. Okay, now to explain this, we're going to extend our existing obliterate macro. So let's open up the editor, and obliterate's right there. Let's say that we want to change this macro so that it will only cast obliterate when we are not holding the Alt key. So open bracket, no mod, colon, Alt, close bracket. The white space here is optional. Click save, and then close it. Now if we want to test it, target the cat like this, and then back up. Notice that if we are not holding Alt, which we currently aren't, it shows obliterate. Now if I hold Alt, notice that our obliterate tooltip disappears. Alright, let's modify the macro one more time so that if we are holding Alt, the macro will cast Death Strike. So come to the end here where it says obliterate, semicolon, open bracket, mod, colon, Alt, close bracket, and then type Death Strike. Okay, save. And we are going to test the macro, so we've got to find Mr. Bigglesworth. Let's run over to him. And notice that our macro is showing obliterate, and if I hold Alt, it shows Death Strike. Okay, now we're going to translate our obliterate macro. Here's the translation. If the player is not pressing Alt, cast obliterate. Else, if the player is pressing Alt, cast Death Strike. Now one thing you'll notice in the example macro is that the semicolon represents the logical else-if construct. So anytime you see a semicolon, it translates into an else-if. Now notice in the command syntax that it says open bracket, condition 1, comma, condition 2. The comma is the logical AND operator. So what it translates to is if condition 1 and condition 2. Okay, now coming back to our obliterate example, let's say that we want to check for a condition that says if the player is not holding Alt and if the player is in their second spec, cast obliterate. So let's open up our macro editor and notice that the code is already in place. Specifically, we have the spec colon 2 comma right before the no mod alt. So that little set of conditions translates to if the player is in his second spec and the player is not holding Alt, then cast obliterate. Okay, let's go ahead and test a macro to make sure it's working. So here's a macro right there. We're going to kill the cat. Okay, it worked perfectly. Now the macro will break if we switch to our other spec. So we're going to activate our other spec, open up the macro editor, see how it's checking for spec 2. Let's drag our obliterate macro right there, and notice that it's not showing the obliterate tooltip. Again, this is because we're checking for spec 2, not spec 1. Okay, now that we've wrapped up conditions, we're going to take a look at some other reserved conditions. You can see a list on the screen right now and what they do. Okay, now notice that we also have the ability to negate any of these conditions by prepending a no to the front of it. So to negate help, you would say no help. To negate harm, you would say no harm, and so on. This makes it a very simple way of negating any condition. As an example, let's create a macro for my Shadow Priest that uses the harm and dead conditions. Okay, so you can see the macro for this on the screen right now. It checks for 3 sets of conditions. It checks to see if our current target is hostile. It checks to see if the target is dead. And it also checks to see if we are out of combat. If those conditions are met, it'll cast Cannibalize. The other condition it checks for is if you're not holding Alt, it'll cast Psychic Horror. And the last condition is if you are holding Alt, it'll cast Psychic Scream. Alright, so we're going to very quickly create this macro. Click on our macro editor macro, click New, type Test as the macro name, don't pick an icon, click OK, and I'm going to paste the macro in. As you can see, it is the same thing that you saw just a second ago. Save, and then we're going to drag it over to the action bar. Let's set it right here, and we're going to test it. Let's very quickly test this macro to make sure that it is working as advertised. So notice that we're not holding Alt, so Psychic Horror is showing up. If we hold Alt, notice that Psychic Scream is showing up. And the last condition that we need to test for is the condition of is our target dead and hostile. If it's dead and hostile, we'll be able to cast Cannibalize on it. We just have to find a mob that we can eat. So let's burn this mob. I don't think I will be able to. Let's burn it anyway, very quickly. Okay, we killed it. Now I'm going to target the dead mob, and notice that the icon changed to cannibalize, but it's not letting us eat it. I think you can only eat like humanoids or something like that. But this is evidence that the macro is working. Okay, we just have one more section that we're going to be covering, creating a DPS macro. This is a very common kind of macro that players have been using since vanilla. In a nutshell, all a DPS macro does is cast all of your DPS cooldowns in one centralized macro. So to construct a DPS macro, we're going to be using the /use command. The way that /use works is it accepts a single numeric parameter, and this numeric parameter represents a particular item of gear on your character. So 1 maps to the helmet. Let's jump down the list. 10 maps to the glove. 13 and 14 map to the first and second trinkets. So this gives you an idea how you can use the /use command to do a lot of very useful things. So that said, I'm going to create a DPS macro for this Shadow Priest. So we're going to open our macro editor, and we're going to find our test and delete it, create another macro called test, and we're going to start off by typing show tooltip, next, /use 13, this is our first trinket, /use 14, this is our second trinket, /use potion of the Jade Serpent, and then last we're going to cast Halo. Okay, save it, and we're going to drag it right there. Alright, we are going to test this macro on a mob. Okay, our Potion of the Jade Serpent is coming off cooldown, so again, it should kick off both of our trinkets, a Potion of the Jade Serpent, and then it should cast Halo. So we're going to start spamming it right now. Okay, notice that it kicked off both the trinket right there and the potion, and it also cast Halo. So that was a success. And that wraps up part 1 of my macro writing series. I'm going to be releasing a part 2 where we will cover some of the more advanced features in writing macros, but that wraps it up for today. Thanks for watching.